What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there, were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
The Hobbled Man by Opinionated IMO. I first noticed him one night while stumbling home from the pub. It was actually in the early morning hours, and not many souls were out and about. Fewer still had a pronounced limp and heavy footfall as he did. Despite his physical infirmity, the dour gent limping behind me managed to traverse the well-worn cobblestones with no issues. The progress he made toward his unknown destination was roughly at the same pace as my own. We continued on, in uncomfortable silence. Neither of us addressed or acknowledged the other. Besides the odd coincidence of both wandering the streets at the ungodly hour of 3 a.m., I didn't place much thought to the hobbling gentleman, 15 paces behind me. I assumed we were just two random fools making our way home in the pre-dawn hours, in a walk of shame. He kept to his side of the roadway, and I stayed on mine. In my hazy stupor, I was too preoccupied with preventing myself from falling face down to engage in pleasantries. Walking required my full attention. A few nights later, I hurried to the market on Huxton Row to buy some fresh groceries. The proprietor closes precisely at 9 p.m., without fail. The stoic merchant was standing right beside his doorway waiting to lock up shop. I assured him I would only be a moment. I told him what I needed, handed him the money, and thanked him for his patience. Off I went, back toward my humble home. He locked the door and departed in the other direction. I breathed a sigh of relief as I walked down the boulevard in the flickering glow of the streetlights. The missus would have had her rolling pin waiting on yours truly if I'd failed to pick up the goods. All was well until I heard that ungraceful footfall behind me again. I didn't want to face him, but my curiosity got the best of me. I felt compelled to make eye contact with the stumbling codger. I glanced over my shoulder, as much to reassure myself as for him. I wish I hadn't. His features were stark and his eyes were lifeless and cold. It chilled me to the marrow. Worse, he completely failed to acknowledge my startling gaze. As before in our previous encounter, we walked separately. This time, however, I was stone cold sober and more aware of the solitary situation. I felt vulnerable walking in front and began to doubt we were headed to different places. The labored presence directly behind me was very unnerving. I felt it wasn't a coincidence. I kept running into the Hobbled Man. His distinctive, uneven cadence somehow married up with his own natural gait. We were in full lockstep until it was difficult to tell them apart. Our footfalls echoed in the cold winter air. Clip, clip, clunk, clip, clip, clunk. It was just out of sync enough to remind me I was being followed by a catatonic-looking ghoul with an asymmetrical shuffle and heaving breath. The hair on my head stood right up in prickles. I clutched my grocery sack tightly as if it was a defensive shield against an imminent attack. My eyes were full open and a fright. Then his pace seemed to quicken. Why was he tailing me? I thought I even felt hot, homicidal breath bearing down me goose-pimpled neck. I was practically sprinting in the pitch dark, having long since left behind the helpful torches of town. Right there, I had a full-blown panic attack. I tossed down my sack of groceries and raced home empty-handed. I was hyperventilating uncontrollably like a terrified child when I bolted up in the front door. The missus was waiting impatiently in the kitchen with an ever-present scowl of disappointment on her face. As soon as she saw my sheer fright, she dropped the rolling pin. I pulled back the curtain to determine if the stumbling cretin with the hollow, expressionless eyes was still in full pursuit. My betrothed could tell I was deathly afraid of something dire, and did her best to console the blubbering fool she had married. I calmed down a bit after a few sips of liquid courage, and tried to recount the cause for my extreme anxiety. She was genuinely concerned until I explained I was being followed by a handicapped cripple who hadn't made any aggressive moves against me at all. Hearing it expressed in the oversimplified, dismissive way, I realized it sounded ridiculous. Clearly, she agreed. Her matrimonial disgust returned with a vengeance. She ordered me to go back out immediately and retrieve our abandoned items. Already being a drunkard and an inattentive lout, I just added coward to my long list of undesirable traits. I backtracked until I found our discarded food lying on the ground. Thankfully, there was no sign of my menacing shadow looming about anymore, and I hurried back home, with my tail tucked between my legs. The missus hadn't experienced his callous sneer or felt the unshakable sense of doom surrounding him when he followed. I tried to explain that in greater detail, but she had absolutely no interest in hearing any sniveling from me. I shut my mouth and gave up. She was never going to understand. How could she? It didn't even make sense to me. This ominous shadow in dark clothes haunted my thoughts in ways which didn't appear to be justified. On the surface, he was simply a disfigured wretch with a prominent hobble who always seemed to wander the streets exactly when I did. My mysterious tormentor hadn't uttered a harsh word, nor raised a finger in malice towards me. His somber profile and disturbing demeanor alone created the irrational suspicions I held. In the clear light of day, I felt like a right silly git for being so spooked. He was merely an unfortunate, ghastly stranger as far as I or anyone else knew. As night fell, however, I wasn't nearly as sure of his coincidental benevolence. Over the next few evenings, I avoided the downtown area like the plague. In the back of my mind, I hoped my lame boogeyman was an aura of evil only came out at night. Sadly, I was wrong about that bit. I caught sight of old Stumbling Gruesome on a couple of occasions which neither night time nor was I alone. Regardless, every subsequent encounter served to magnify my paralyzing apprehension. I dared not point him out to my disappointed love. Either she'd mock me mercilessly for being so mortified by the mere sight of a harmless, unfortunate figure, or worse yet, she might not see him at all. In the back of my mind, that would have been enough to pack me in, square me away. He was just a miserable sot like me who I've created a fanciful mythology about him being an evildoer. That would be bad enough. But if no one else could see the innocent bugger, then my mind would have been gone. There's no cure for that. It would have been the old straitjacket and loony bin for Mr. Ian McTaskin. I didn't want to know if no one else could see him. The cunning way he was always seen to be closing in behind me, but then would disappear into thin air. Worried me far more than potential bodily harm by a lurking simpleton with a bum leg. Sunday morning, the vicar delivered their fire and brimstone sermon from the pulpit, as he always does. A broken record orator he is. My bride glared at me sideways, while listening to the repetitive lecture on the dire evils of drinking a few pints down at the pub. She was trying to decide if the holy words of wisdom might finally be sinking in, or if I'd always be a worthless drunkard who disappointed her daily. Truthfully, I hadn't been to the pub all week thanks to the creepy old sot who I kept running into. I played the part of the pious, repentant spouse, and she seemed temporarily satisfied that maybe there was some hope yet for my wayward soul. After all, it's a game as old as time itself. We both play it to make her feel good. Sadly, any tally marks I'd erased in her black book of marital mistakes were quickly replaced when I dared to ask the vicar about the Hobbled Man who was stalking my thoughts night and day. The wife was beyond furious I'd shamed her publicly by admitting the tale I'd told her. She assured it was merely alcohol-fueled nonsense and excused my forked tongue. That was before she saw the look on the preacher's solemn, weathered mug. It immediately changed her tune. "You saw a disgruntled-looking, lame fellow in a dark suit? Did he follow you for any distance at all, McTaskin? Oh, merciful Lord! The Hobbled Man evil spirit must have attached himself to an endangered soul. Has he stalked you more than once?" I nodded nervously at his volley of accusatory-sounding questions, as my ball and chain looking on in a rising tide of trepidation. Both their faces were aghast in widening mortal dread. While I wanted her to believe me about my stumbling shadow, I certainly didn't want to bring a heightened sense of despair into the process. They acted as if I had attached a demon from the fiery pits of hell to lurk directly behind me, all to snatch up my inebriated soul. I'll be deathly honest, their fear was contagious. I was already straddling the fence about my expressionless stalker being a diabolical spirit of the worst and most evil sort, But the vicar's marked awareness of his malicious entity and his aim for me was all the convincing I needed. I've been guilty in the past of the sin of pride, among many other well-documented failures, but I was lightning quick to beg for his holy guidance. I was down on my knees with fingers clasped to get shed of old Beelzebub. Most of the things I was directed to do was no real sacrifice. I had to attend church services every Sunday and pay my tithes to fund the Lord's work in combating evil throughout the world. I had to say me prayers each night and confess my dirty sins to gain the Lord's absolution. I was commanded to be more respectful to my sweet Connie McTaskin and to strive to be more of an honest man. That really paid off since he stopped hitting me with the rolling pin and frying pan and gave me loving on a regular basis. The only item I really struggled with was to give up the devil's medicine. The vicar demanded I stop going to the pub. That's the God's honest truth from my lips to your ears. I missed fellowship with the lads and throwing back a pint or two, but to his credit, not once did I run into the Hobbled Man again after I changed my ways and turned to the church. Eventually, I came to accept their noble sacrifice for the benefit of having my mortal soul and making sweet Connie love me again. That was until a decade later when I was introduced to M. Emmett Green, the vicar's crippled nephew. There was no telling how many errant husbands and body hell-raisers the Hobbled Man cleverly spooked with their creative ruse. Obviously, it worked masterfully on me to give up the bottle, and I realized immediately when I laid eyes on him that my wife knew the vicar's tricky plan all along. I'll admit, their sly deception inspired me to straighten my life, and I'm a better man for it, no doubt about it. You'd quit drinking too if you were followed by the Hobbled Man when you left the pub. It's probably what they mean when they say, the Lord works in mysterious ways.